When you have a company that's as huge, productive, and has been around as long as Nintendo, you're not just going to have huge, well-known titles that are the poster children of gaming. You're also going to have a lot of titles that fall through the cracks and end up becoming really obscure. Nintendo's often been called the Disney of game developers, and that seems fitting seeing as how they've had huge smash hit franchises under their belt, undeniably some of the most recognizable in the entire medium. But then you also have lesser known titles that get locked up in the proverbial vault. For every Mario, there's a custom Robo, for every Zelda, there's a Star Tropics, and for every Kirby, there's a Starfy. These series are often left to languish in obscurity with the exception of a rare re-release or reference in a WarioWare title or something. Give Nintendo some credit, they've been bold enough to experiment over the years, but unsurprisingly, it's always those titles with the more niche appeal that end up getting left in the dust. I remember playing Smash Bros. Melee and Brawl and being really intrigued by these cool, weird-looking characters on the trophies, wondering what the hell games they were from and looking them up online. It was especially intriguing with Melee since many of the titles hadn't even been released yet. One of those games was Cubivore, Survival of the Fittest, which would release almost a full year after Melee in 2002. Nintendo had published the game in Japan, but it sold well below expectations, leading them to pass on a North American release. Thankfully, Atlus decided to swoop in and give the game a chance in the NA market. But no matter who the publisher was, Cubivore simply refused to sell, leading it to sadly become one of the rarest titles for the GameCube, right behind Path of Radiance and Gotcha Force. So if you're wondering why no one really talks about this game anymore, that'd be why. But now, let's really give it an up-close examination and see what we've been missing out on for all these years. You are an animal, a titular Cubivore, born into the wilderness and determined to top the food chain by taking down the killer Cubivore. Pretty simple setup, and there's not much in the way of plot developments or other characters you'll meet. Your goal's pretty static throughout the entire adventure, and you'll never meet any other character that speaks for themselves. Everything's either to fight and eat, or to mate with. As in nature, it's every man, or beast rather, for himself, a point that the game reinforces pretty well, but more on that later. However, despite said story being pretty simple, there's quite a bit more dialogue here than I was expecting. All inner monologues from your player character. This includes a surprising amount of introspective moments between chapters. I wasn't expecting this game to really have a whole lot to say, or if it did, it'd be one of those games where you'd be hammering on the A button, flying through the dialogue to get back to the action. But you'll honestly become pretty endeared to your little cube beast as it ponders the life of the wilderness, evolution, and natural selection. Which is especially helped with how charming and oftentimes hilarious the dialogue is, setting a great contrast. As to be expected with nearly all titles that they've published, Atlus did a great service to the game's dialogue with another fantastic localization. It has personality, it's not at all flat, standard video game text. It flip-flops back and forth between David Attenborough-esque musings on the animal kingdom to Earthbound-like wordplay and amusing anecdotes pretty seamlessly. I'm really not joking when I say there were a few times that actually made me crack up laughing, which a game hasn't done intentionally for quite some time. By the way, I passed wind of good information. Passed wind? Caught wind? Anyway, I got a fat tip. Word on the street is, in the next level I can meet a female, or something like that. This even extends to the names of the bosses as they're given mundane official names like CEO or corporate management. As someone who hardly understands Japanese, I can't really say for sure how much of this is reflected in the original script, but as long as the English text is concerned, Atlus's translation team managed to nail a tone reflective of the game's quirky art style while retaining its more subtle, somber themes and undertones. I definitely wasn't expecting the game's themes to go to such deep places, but that's nothing compared to how unexpectedly complex Cubivore's mechanics and gameplay are. Don't let the simple, cute, boxy art style fool you. Cubivore has a lot more going on than you might think. It's kind of hard to pin down what genre Cubivore belongs to, but I think action RPG would probably be the closest descriptor. Your goal in each stage is to reach the exit, which is unlocked by devouring the boss. Sometimes the route to the boss is blocked off by inaccessible areas, which can be unlocked by eating insects called Wildebugs, but more often than not, the real obstruction is that you'll be way too weak to tackle the boss when you first enter the area. In fact, in a lot of levels, you can usually fight them right away. You're just not strong enough to fight him yet. You'll need to explore the stage a little bit and grow stronger. You can find what's called training grounds, which will boost your various stats based on what kind of training ground it is. You can beat up on a wooden horse to boost your attack, run on a treadmill to boost your speed, fun stuff like that. Most games would just put a stat increase in a chest or have it be like a consumable laying in the open, but it's not really in Cubivore's nature to do anything typical. It doesn't add to the overall design of the game or anything, it's just another one of those small quirky details that lends it a bit of charm. But anyway, those stat increases only come around so often. The main central mechanic in Cubivore, the core that the entire game is built around, is eating other Cubivores and changing forms, or as the game calls it, mutation. Almost every creature you encounter comes in one of 5 colors, and those colors each have their own strengths. Yellow has the best attack and defense, but it's also really slow, meaning that you're going to be taking a lot of hits, but you should be able to take what you dish out as well. It's probably the first color you'll grow adjusted to, since it's pretty mindless to use. Blue is a bit of a glass cannon, having lousy defense but being able to attack from long distances, meaning if you mutate into a blue form, it's best to play a keep-away style of combat. Red has poor attack, but can jump the highest, right over enemies as they try to charge you. The idea with this one is to go for a counterattack once your enemy's attack whiffs. Purple has an amazing turn rate and can shuffle backwards faster than any other variety of beast, allowing you to weave in and out of combat and punish your opponent when it misses or its guard's down. It's the most difficult to master, but it can do wonders once you get the hang of it. And then there's Gray, which is sort of the all-around class with the most balanced stats. The only exception would be speed, which it excels in over the other forms. If you eat enough of the same color, your shape will change as well, and that's a whole different story. Depending on the color you have, you'll want a certain form to complement it. For example, you'd want your limbs to be on the side in a wing-like formation if you're going red, since it allows you to get even better airtime. And then you need to keep track of how dark your color is since it makes you stronger and man, it's a lot to keep track of. Way more than I was expecting from a game where you're waddling around as a little blocky pig. The mutations in eating your enemies are really the backbone that keeps Cubivore interesting, because while I will say the combat is fun on its own, it's also really simple. You have a tackle move that will do more damage if you hit the enemy from a weak point, the ability to back up, jump, and block, and well, that's about it really. There is some nuance in the sense that, much like in the actual wild, you're equally as much prey as you are a predator. Any enemy can start targeting you and make your radar light up in danger. They all obey the same rules as you as well. For example, when I was fighting an enemy, I thought I'd cheese him by standing in a rare pool of water you can find that heals you up quickly, but it heals him if he's standing in it as well. They can bite your limbs off too, just like you can do with them. You're really one in a million among the many beasts that live in this wilderness, and I do like how the game communicated that. Also, the AI for your opponents aren't stupid by any means. They actually exhibit some fairly realistic behavior. Like when they're low on health and they realize they're definitely not going to win the fight, they'll turn and run. It's little things like that that keep Cubivore's combat engaging, regardless of how one-note it might seem at first. But it's finding the right form for the job that really keeps you invested, and the game will incentivize you to try as many forms as possible. For one thing, in order to fight the final boss, you'll need to make 100 unique mutations, so you can't just stick with the same form that works and run it into the ground. You really need to make a conscious effort to seek out new forms. The game's level design also does a great job of encouraging this by presenting different challenges. There's one level, for example, where the bosses are herbivores and won't fight you at all, but they're insanely quick on their feet and hard to keep up with, so you want to seek out as much gray meat as possible, which the level supplies just enough of to keep up with them and catch them. Another real kicker is the fact that eating enemies is your primary way of healing in Cubivore. Like I mentioned before, there's sometimes pools of water, or you can even snack on some grass, but they're not always guaranteed to be around. And eating an enemy in order to heal is actually a double-edged sword. In a pinch, you might need to eat the nearest Cubivore in sight to get some quick healing in, but that Cubivore might not be the color that you need right now. So, do you heal yourself in the short term only to kinda gimp yourself in the long run by diluting those colors you worked so hard to earn? This is especially true for the little enemies that assist the boss, since they're entirely colorless, meaning they heal you, but they're actively detrimental otherwise. You can always chew an enemy up and spit him out to kill him, but you won't be healing that way. It's a really fascinating idea to make the player reconsider whether they want to heal or not. Usually in games you see a health power-up and instinctively grab it without a second thought, since it's an inherently good thing and kind of a no-brainer. But you kinda need to think it through a little bit more in Cubivore. The only other game I can think of that does such a thing would be the indie roguelike Downwell, which came out a few years back. That game had health power-ups that switch out the type of gun you have equipped as well, which may very well be a downgrade in some cases. I feel like there's a lot of untapped potential here for other games to try something like this, as it's a fascinating little bit of design. Now, you'd think it'd be a pain to keep track of all the different forms, since you mutate each time you scarf down a bunch of the same color, but the devs thought of that. In almost every level, in order to grow some new limbs, you go into a tunnel in order to mate. Yeah, mating, killing, you're even shitting. Cubivore. Rated E for everyone, by the way. Usually found towards the beginning of a new area, breeding grounds will grant you a new limb, allowing you to access a whole variety of new forms. But more crucially, you'll have the option to choose a form for what's called Easy Mutate, which you can switch back to any time. You switch to these forms by using the D-pad, so long as you're not in a fight. Because they're colorless, however, this is more a blank slate for you to build upon, rather than immediately relying on it and using it in actual combat like a crutch. Like I mentioned before, this game's all about trying different things and hunting down a new form in each level, so it's handy, but it's not meant to be overly relied on. The forms you're offered after you mate might also be ones that you haven't accessed yet, so you might be presented with a choice. Do you want to easily add a new form to your bestiary, getting you one step closer to the endgame? Or do you want to pick something that you've already used and you're comfortable with that you can fall back on with an easy mutation whenever you need to? Now, I've had some high praise for Cubivore, but unfortunately, as you would expect from a B-list title of this era, it's a bit rough around the edges, if you'll pardon the expression. One thing that's kind of hard to argue against is how lousy the camera is. Now, I can get behind a camera that's atypical if it justifies itself and serves a purpose to the gameplay, but Cubivore's camera felt really strained and constricted for no reason. Despite using a lock-on system for enemies, Cubivore decided not to use the camera systems that you find in games like Ocarina of Time and Mega Man Legends, even though those were released well after it entered development. Instead, you're given a godforsaken manual camera that gives you really limited information in the heat of a battle. For one thing, you can't tilt the stick to steer the camera continuously. You need to keep giving it tiny little clicks in one direction over and over to move it in 45-degree intervals. It's very clearly a holdover from when Cubivore started development as an N64 title, since it immediately brings the C buttons to mind rather than the stick. You also can't pull the camera back to see the entire area at once, but I guess that would have given the player the ability to spot secret areas by using the bird's eye view. You can jerk the stick upwards to position it right behind your Cubivore, but it feels like such a bandaged solution that you're going to be relying on far more often than necessary. Eventually, you'll come to terms with the camera and learn to work around it, but this is something that definitely needed to be looked at a bit more thoroughly and fixed. If Cubivore were to get some sort of port, remake, or remaster, this would probably be the most necessary change to make. Another smaller problem might be that the game's tutorials don't make it perfectly clear on how certain mechanics work or what some terminologies even mean. Thankfully, the game's developers did catch on to this and had the foresight to include a rulebook in the pause menu that you can consult at any time. Would it have been better if those early tutorials were explained a bit better? Yeah, but at the very least they managed to catch the problem and provide some sort of solution. Also, I'd recommend keeping the game's manual handy as, among other things, it has a really helpful cheat sheet for what each of the color's strengths and weaknesses are. One issue that might be more a matter of preference is how repetitive the game can be, a point that many critics took the game to task for back in the day upon its release. The varying playstyles do lend a bit of variety, but the enemies on the other hand never change, and your goal in each level is pretty much always the same. I'd argue one thing that keeps Cubivore from getting repetitive is the level design. Like I mentioned before, the game really encourages you to learn and try out the different forms, but even outside of that context, the levels can be laid out in really interesting ways. For example, there's a level really early on where the colored meat is all in a blocked off area, but the wildebugs you need to eat in order to unlock said area are right behind the boss. You need to run like hell since you're way too underpowered to fight this guy or his cronies, and you just gotta grab the bugs and hightail it out of there. It's surprisingly really tense, and it's a great little bit of level design. Still, for many, Cubivore is probably going to be a game that's best enjoyed in short bursts. It's not something you're going to want to binge from beginning to end. That's only taking the game's first loop into consideration, however. If you fail to get 100 mutations by the time you've gone through all the game's levels, the game kicks you back to cycle through them over and over and over again until you meet the criteria, and that is a little bit of a drag. Going through the same levels you've already seen, just mindlessly making mutations until you reach that arbitrary goal is definitely going to put some people off. It's repetition in the worst sense of the word because it's very thinly veiled padding in order to give Cubivore a longer playtime. Now, on the other hand, I do really like when a game presents a higher challenge for the player to strive for besides just reaching the end credits. And getting all 100 mutations in one cycle is that end goal for the player. It actually makes Cubivore a bit more enjoyable on subsequent playthroughs. The game even encourages this by giving you an unlockable alternate art style that makes the creatures look a bit more realistic, just like how they do in the game manual. Ugh. Anyone else think it looks like one of those HD texture packs for Mario 64 or something? In this sense, Cubivore does have quite a bit of replay value and encourages the player to really master its mechanics, but on that first playthrough, you're really going to find yourself hitting a bit of a slog once the honeymoon wears off. While the camera controls were an unfortunate holdover from the game's N64 origins, one thing that actually held up really well from that point in development is the game's art style. The overly polygonal character designs, even the boxy landscapes, might have been born from limitations, but it's still very stylized and charming, just like a lot of things about the game. Yeah, okay, the textures do look pretty rough, even for a GameCube title, but hey, they managed to nail what actually matters, which is the titular Cubivores that you're going to be looking at more often than anything. Then again, I'd hope they'd be able to, considering how basic these things look. With Minecraft having become one of the biggest video games on the planet and spawning a wave of imitators, a game where literally everything is a block might seem kinda passé. But back in 2002, this was honestly a really unique art style. Nothing else really looked like it at the time and wouldn't for a while. Plus, they take this concept and absolutely run with it. The environments, the sun, and the moon are all cubes as well, yes, but even the HUD sticks to this aesthetic. The game's font is really angular and squarish, almost pixelated. And hell, the game's aspect ratio is even letterboxed. It's really admirable how much they wanted to commit to this style, and even to this day, among all the other cube or voxel-based games, Cubivore manages to stand out. The music also manages to set the mood really well, being nice and relaxed during the game's slower sections. and tense during the game's boss theme. Though said boss theme can also maybe be a little redundant since it's only a few notes long. But on the other hand, the choice of classic instrumentation as opposed to an electronic soundtrack is really appropriate given the game's naturalistic setting and themes. This is also reinforced by some excellent sound design. You'll hear a lot of ambient animal noises from afar, crickets chirp when night falls, the grass shuffles under your feet, or whatever you want to call those things. Honestly, it's easy to forget that this game stars a bunch of living cubes gnawing on each other. At times it can really make you feel like you're one with nature. So yes, the game is, as you would expect from most of Nintendo's B-sides, flawed, but it's got a heart and passion that really manages to shine through. This was clearly a game that the devs had a lot of fun working on. Which really begs the question, who was responsible for this unique little title? There's a bit of a common misunderstanding that the game was an in-house Nintendo joint co-developed with Intelligent Systems. The latter half is true, but the main developers for Cubivore were a small team known as Saru Brune. And while they weren't first-party devs for Nintendo, they were a lot closer than you might think. Or at least, that was the case for the game's lead director, or Killer Cubivore as he's referred to in the game's credits, Gento Matsumoto. At the beginning of his career, Matsumoto was a designer for Nintendo, and was even at one point Shigeru Miyamoto's right-hand assistant. But by 1989, he left Nintendo and founded Saru Brune, which actually didn't start out as a game developer, instead being more of a graphic design studio that occasionally dabbled in software. But unfortunately, tragedy struck rather early on when, for 6 months from 1994 to 95, Matsumoto would actually end up doing prison time for, of all things, traffic violations. Matsumoto remained humble despite all of this and actually claimed that the time did him good, having a positive effect on him, and he even published an autobiography entitled Not a Diary Book, detailing his sentence. In 1998, Saru Brune put out what could be called their first real video game in the traditional sense, which was Jungle Park Saturn Island for the Sega Saturn. It was sort of a cross between an adventure game and a minigame collection, and looking at the art style, the overall theme of animals and nature, and the fact that the main monkey character actually makes an appearance in Cubivore's option setting, it's pretty clear that this is indeed from the same developer. Matsumoto's new team caught his former boss's attention and was financed to make a new game for Nintendo, with Gabin Ito from Nanaonsha serving as producer and editor. But because the N64's days were evidently numbered, no thanks in part due to the failure of the N64 disk drive, development wisely shifted to the GameCube, and Cubivore was finally released in 2002. So if you're wondering how that trophy ended up in Melee, that'd be why. The game had actually been in development for a while up until that point. Even though Cubivore was a very unusual title, it was, as Matsumoto noted during a press conference for the game, the most standard game that he'd made while being in the director's chair. It only figures that a guy who made such atypical titles previously would make something so unusual even when working within the standard video game protocols of killing, leveling up, boss battles, etc, etc. Cubivore would sadly, however, be the last title Matsumoto worked on, as Saru Brune was dissolved following Cubivore's release, probably due to the financial disappointments in both Japan and North America. While he may not be in the game industry anymore, Matsumoto's actually kept himself plenty busy, publishing more memoirs, doing various graphic design works, but most notably being the chief creative officer for BCCKS, an online publishing firm for ebooks and paperbacks not unlike Amazon. Matsumoto's clearly a talented man, and while it is a shame that we probably won't ever see another video game from him, it is really good to see that he's at least doing well. Cubivore is really a product of its time for Nintendo. In a desperate scramble to get any third-party software on board for the GameCube, which really wasn't doing too hot, Nintendo threw their weight behind some really innovative talent in the video game industry. Lovedelic, the creators of Moon Remix RPG, split up and many of its members formed a new company, Skip, who would make the original Chibi Robo for GameCube, with Nintendo publishing and producing the title. Kazutoshi Iida used to work for ArtDink and made some really avant-garde titles for the original PlayStation, and would eventually make a new game, Doshin the Giant, with his new studio Param. Again, Nintendo co-developed and helped publish this title. But Cubivore is probably the weirdest of all, and you hear that term a lot in games, weird, usually referring to a game's art style or writing or cultural differences coming from Japan. Cubivore has all of that, but it's the neat, interesting mechanics that it brings to the table that makes it a really standout and bizarre title. And when I call something weird or bizarre, believe me, I mean it as a compliment, full stop. The only problem, as I mentioned before, is going to be that asking price. I'm doubtful it'll ever happen since Cubivore isn't exactly a game with a lot of mainstream appeal, but it'd really be nice if Nintendo or Atlus would give it some sort of port, re-release, remaster, remake, anything really. Hell, they could even buff out some of the kinks in the process, like finally fixing the camera. But because Nintendo doesn't seem keen on bringing back the Virtual Console and have, to this day, never put GameCube titles up for a re-release in such a fashion, the only thing we really have to hold on to is a spirit in the latest Smash Bros. Title, which is fitting since, like I said before, the reason that most people even know about Cubivore is because of Melee. Definitely a flawed title, as you can tell Matsumoto and his team were getting used to making a more traditional video gaming experience, but it is still worth checking out. If you can find the means to play it without having to sell a kidney, I say go for it.